All right, I think we are streaming on our sites now. Give me just a minute to correct a few things. All right, I think we are where we need to be, and everything is in line. I apologize for that hiccup. I just forgot to click a few things, and so we've got that all going. Thank you for joining us tonight. We are in our Wednesday night Bible class, whereas we continue to study the book of Exodus. Tonight, we are continuing into Exodus 12. We are looking at the 10th and final plague. We're going to see tonight Israel getting the final plague and what they had to do to avoid that plague. And then we're going to see what the repercussions of that plague is and how Pharaoh and the Egyptians respond. Again, I think this is a story that we're pretty familiar with. We all know, but we're going to look at it again to see it and see if there's some more things we may could have caught up or may have missed in our earlier readings. As I said, we'll begin in chapter 21, or verse 21 of chapter 12. Verse 21, we begin by looking here. Remember, the first 20 verses was sort of an interruption to the narrative. When you look at the end of chapter 11, Moses, in writing this book, interrupts the narrative, the story, to tell us some regulations, to tell us, okay, this is how this is going to affect people later. And he'll do that in a couple of places. He does it very frequently in his writings, where he will tell about how that affects the people now, how that affects what they're experiencing, what they're preparing for. And so he's told that. And if you look at chapter 11, I believe verse 8 or so, you can see, if you go from chapter 11, verse 8 to verse 21 of chapter 12, you'll see the story continues. It is almost like it's uninterrupted, except for that little break to tell us this. And Moses just wants to give us the background for why they are, or why the Jews do some of the things they do. So we'll begin in verse 21 and we'll pick back up, seeing what Moses has told the people to do. It says, "And Moses called all the elders of Israel and said to them, Go and select lambs for yourselves according to your clans and kill the Passover lamb. Take a bunch of hyssop and dip it in the blood that is in the basin, and touch the lintel and the two doorposts with blood that is in the basin. None of you shall go out of the door of his house until the morning. For the Lord will pass through to strike the Egyptians. And when he sees the blood on the lintel and on the two doorposts, the Lord will pass over the door and will not allow the destroyer to enter your homes to strike you. And you shall observe this rite as a statute for you and your sons forever. And when you come to the land that the Lord will give you, as he has promised, you will keep this service. And when your children say to you, What do you mean by this service? And you shall say, It is a sacrifice of the Lord's Passover. For he passed over the houses of the people of Israel in Egypt when he struck the Egyptians, but spared our houses. And the people bowed their heads in worship. Then the people of Israel went and did so, as the Lord had commanded Moses and Aaron, so they did." So what we see here is Moses begins to speak to the people. Now, what's interesting about this plague is the timing. And we believe this timing is very key, because it sets up some things God has told him. It appears that God sends Moses to Pharaoh early in the morning or during the day to tell him about what the Passover is going to include, or what this 10th plague is going to be. And then very quickly following that, Moses tells the people of Israel, you've got to get ready. Now, this is interesting because in the actual Passover, they're supposed to select the lamb on day 10, and they're supposed to keep it till day 14 and then slaughter. But that waiting period seems to be abated here. And then Moses goes to the elders and says, look, here's what you've got to do. And he lays out what they're supposed to do. You notice he says, go select lambs for yourselves according to your clans. Every family goes and you go kill the Passover lamb. You go take the Passover lamb, you drain it of its blood, you put the blood on the lintel and on the doorpost. Then you roast the lamb whole, as we've already said a minute ago. We'll talk more about that as we get through this. But you notice he says here in verse 22, take a bunch of hyssop. Now, hyssop is a type of herb that the Israelites would use. And what happens with this hyssop is the way it's made up of, is that if you bind it together to a bunch, is made for what some people are saying is the most potent sprinkler you can find. Meaning that what you do is you take this hyssop with this herb, and you wrap a bunch of it together and dip it in a liquid, and you could sling it, and it would sling out and it would sprinkle the blood. And so that's sort of what that's the idea of what the Israelites did here. They take this hyssop, they dip it in the blood, and on the two lintels and on the lintel and the two doorposts, they take it and they begin to spread the blood on it. They sprinkle the blood on it. This practice of using the hyssop to sprinkle things is going to be seen later. There are certain sacrifices that are going to be offered that's going to use the hyssop, dipped in blood, dipped in water, dipped in various things, and it's going to be sprinkled or thrown on the people or the objects that are blessed. And so this is a very interesting idea of how they use this herb. And then we get another interesting insight into this plague in this next part, in the end of verse 22, in that God tells the Israelites through Moses, when you go into your house at night, you go in at night, you roast the lamb, you go take it in to eat it, you don't leave the house. Not one of you shall go out of the door of his house until morning. He says, you stay there. That way you avoid this plague. That way you don't get caught. And the idea is that if you're caught outside your home, there's no guaranteed protection for you. Now, we may look and say, oh, well, surely God would know who the Israelites was, and he tries to avoid this, and he could spare them if he wanted to. Yes, he could have. But he does this to enforce or reinforce the idea that the Israelites need to hear him. And not only to hear him, the Israelites need to and must obey him and obey everything he says and everything he's taught, so that they will be able to be spared from this plague. That's very interesting. This is one of the few plagues where the Israelites are given instructions of how to avoid this plague. The other plagues, the plague 4 through plague 9, that God spared Israel from, they're never given instructions of, okay, if you do this, you'll miss out on the plague. But this one, they're told, if you do these certain things, this plague's not coming upon you. So here, Israel has to take action. Israel has to do something. And that's very important. What we see in our faith of God is that God can do so much, but God still requires us to do something. God still requires us to obey him. And so he gives this instruction in verse 23. We're told about what God's going to do, where God says he's going to pass through. He's going to pass through the streets of Egypt, and he's going to strike down the Egyptians. And notice this. God says this is him. He is the one going to do this. And he says when he sees the blood on the lintel and on the doorpost, he's going to pass it over. He's going to skip that door. And then you notice he says he will not allow the destroyer to enter into your house. Well, what is this destroyer? Well, there's other verses that talk about this destroyer, or what you may consider a death angel. And what I mean by death angel is that this is an angel, a messenger of God, who is given a specific mission, and whose mission is to cause death. When we look throughout the Old Testament, there are times that we see this destroyer appear, or a destroyer, not necessarily the same one, but a destroyer appears and typically brings plagues with it. It brings death and destruction. And God will say he's in control of this angel. And that's what we can see here, that God is in control. God says, I will limit him. I will tell him where to go and where not to go. And then you notice he says in verse 24, he reinforces the idea we said earlier in the first 20 verses that we read, that this is going to be a rite, a ritual, that you are going to go forever. God says, this is what I want you to do every year. You're going to watch over this ritual. You're going to do this time to remember what I've done to you. And then you notice he says, when you come into the land that the Lord will give you, as he promised, you shall keep his service. And so the statement is that especially during the time of their reign or their living in Egypt, this is going to be a yearly ritual the Jews are supposed to keep. Now, we're going to see as we go throughout these books that there are times they keep this ritual like they're supposed to, and there's other times they don't. There are certain kings who kept this and certain ones who didn't. And the ones who did, when they find out that Israel hadn't been kept in like they should have, those kings are just dismayed and bow down before God and offer their forgiveness to God, offer their repentance to God because of how severe their disobedience is. We know this from there, verse 26, and he says that when you gather every year, this is a very important thing. God says when you gather every year to do this rite, to do this meal, to do this remembrance, he said it's going to cause your kids to do something. Very interesting. He says it's going to cause your kids to ask, what do you mean by this service or this rite? What do you mean by this ritual? Daddy, why do we do this? And God says, this is what you're going to tell him. You're going to tell him your story. You shall say, it is the sacrifice of the Lord's Passover. We're doing it to celebrate Passover, when God passed over the people of Israel in Egypt and he struck the Egyptians. And so here he says, this is going to be a commandment, a teaching. And this is very important what God's going to do. And God's going to lay out a couple of these laws out that he's going to say that the teaching of the children, the teaching of the following generations does not fall to Moses, doesn't fall to certain people, but it falls strictly upon the parents, falls heavily upon the parents. Let me put it that way. The parents are to teach their children what has happened. And when they ask, the parents are going to know that this is what occurred. And this is to be forever. For as long as the Jews are people, this is a celebration. It's even celebrated still today, that they take this time to celebrate the Passover. And then you notice what happens in verse 27. He says, and the people bowed their heads in worship. The people realized what God was doing for them. They realized this was God's way. And here's God speaking to them. And Moses telling them, look, this is it. After this plague is over, the promise will be revealed. The promise will come to fruition. You're going to leave Egypt. And so they bowed their heads and they worshiped God. And then you notice that when Moses and the Lord had told these people to do this, they went. Very key. They went and did so. Very interesting thing we see Moses. When God commands Moses to go do something, typically we see Moses, it says Moses went and did it. Moses followed it through. Moses did exactly what God said he was supposed to do. Here again, we see God telling Moses to do something, and Moses and Aaron tell the people, and the people do it. They ensure that the people do exactly as God commanded. They keep this Passover feast. And then you get to verse 29, and verse 29 tells us this plague. Very interesting that there's all this buildup to this plague, but this plague happens in just one verse. Probably one of the shortest descriptions of a plague, but yet it's one of the most devastating. And God says at midnight, the Lord struck down all the firstborn of the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on his throne to the firstborn of the captive who is in the dungeon, and the firstborn of the livestock. And Pharaoh rose up in the night, he and all of his servants and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was not a house where someone was not dead. Now, notice God's fulfillment of this is at midnight. At midnight, in the middle of the night, God strikes down the firstborn of Israel, or Egypt. And notice this description. He strikes it down from Pharaoh, who sat on the throne, to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon. The greatest in Egypt, all the way down to the least. Remember last week they talked about the slave girl at the millstone. Another person who would have to do that job, considered one of the lowliest jobs, was the captive in the dungeon. That was a punishment, a torture for a prisoner captive, was to make them work and to do this millstone. It took a long time. And again, is Moses' way of speaking of God's word, that from the top of Egypt, from Egyptian society to the very bottom of Egyptian society was struck with this plague. And you notice the end of verse 30, before we talk about verse 30, is that there was not a house. There wasn't one place that wasn't affected by this plague. Every house lost someone. Imagine that for a minute. I was thinking about that as in our world today with this virus we've had that has torn through our nation and some of the problems it's caused with people. But could you imagine? And some people put this up to be this bad, but could you imagine what it would be like if this coronavirus, when it hit, that it caused such devastation that every person or every house in the United States has somebody die in it? Or even in the county or even in the state of Mississippi. If all of Mississippi had every house, somebody died in that house. You don't even shrink it smaller. Imagine Itawamba County. Imagine the city of Fulton. How devastating that would be is if in one night, every house lost someone, the firstborn son of that house. That's where Egypt is. They have fought, they have rebelled, they have refused to listen to God, and they have brought upon themselves the worst plague of all, the plague of death. The plague that took the firstborn. Again, remember, the firstborn was a position of honor. In Pharaoh's house, it was the next Pharaoh. It was the next Pharaoh who was going to take the throne. The one that Pharaoh had been grooming since he had been born to take his place. And now in an instant, the God of the Israelites have taken it away from him. And I've always wondered about this. I wonder what this must have been like, because you would think something had to have happened. There had to be a noise, a feeling, something, because it says that Pharaoh rose up in the night and all his servants, all the Egyptians, everybody woke up during the night to find their loved one dead. But what caused them to wake up? I don't know. I don't know if it was a sound, like I said, or if it was one of those feelings you sometimes have. I don't know what it was, but there was something that caused people to wake up in the middle of the night, and they walked into the room of their oldest son. They went to check on their oldest child, and they were dead. Ones who were little bitty children to those who were way on up older. And the other thing about these households, you got to understand this, in the ancient world, when you had a household, it wasn't just a one family that lived there. It was an extended family usually. In most household complexes, you would have what we would consider a grandmother and grandfather who lived with their children and under the same roof in the same complex with their children with them, if not great-grandchildren. They had families that lived in the same general area. So you may be dealing with a situation where the grandparents wake up and not only has their grandson died, but also their son has died. And this has just wreaked all throughout the houses of Egypt. And the Egyptians cry out. And again, you notice he said there was a great cry, a horrible cry that went all throughout the land of Egypt. And it was so great that Pharaoh himself woke up in the middle of the night with his servants. Again, these are his officials. And they all woke up. And then you notice verse 31, and he summoned Moses and Aaron by night and said, "Up. Go out from among my people, both you and the people of Israel. Go serve the Lord your God as you have said. Take your flocks, your herds, as you have said. Be gone and bless me also." Now, notice Pharaoh summons Moses and Aaron by night. The night's not even passed. Pharaoh wakes up in the middle of the night. He sees what's happened. And Pharaoh sends for Moses to come. Now, you may say, no, wait a minute. I thought Moses told the people not to leave their house after midnight. Yes, he's right. He told them not to leave their house at night. But I have a feeling that God told Moses, when Pharaoh says, come, you come. You go to Pharaoh in the middle of the night. You're exempt from this rule to stay home. But just because they need this statement. And notice what Pharaoh says here. What's interesting in Hebrew in this, verse 31 and 32, is there's a lot of imperatives. There's a lot of action verbs, where he says, up, go out. Then in verse 32, be gone. Those are commands, urgency. Basically, Pharaoh says, get out of my place. Get out of my country. Go serve your God. Go do whatever you want to do. Just leave. And he emphatically says that. And he says, you go, Moses, Aaron, and all the people of Israel. All your flocks, all that you begged for, get out, leave, be gone. And the emphatic statement here is go Go serve the Lord. Go worship your God. Because remember what Moses said, and this is what's always interested me to start this whole thing off. Moses tells Pharaoh that very first time he meets him, we need to go worship our God. Because if we don't, there's no telling what he might do. Now, that's not literal. That's Matt's translation. Is Moses says, if we don't go worship him, he's going to cause trouble be upon us. Well, Pharaoh rebuked him and laughed at him that time. Now Pharaoh's seen what's happened because Israel didn't go and worship their God. But it wasn't because Israel didn't want to go. It's because Pharaoh didn't want to let them go. And so Pharaoh finally says, go. And then in the end of verse 32, Pharaoh makes a very interesting statement. And all this time of being under in Egypt and all these plagues that this God has done upon him, and this death of his firstborn son, how terrible and horrendous that must have been. Pharaoh makes a very interesting statement to Moses, where he says, bless me. Bless me also. The idea is ask your God to bless me. Ask your God to be with me. Why? Because Pharaoh has finally accepted the fact, the truth, that Moses' God is the true God. Moses' God is more powerful than the God of Egypt. The gods of Egypt. And Pharaoh says, bless me. The other interesting about this is very humbling for Pharaoh. Because you remember at the end of chapter 10, Pharaoh's last time he saw Moses was if I ever see your face again, I'm going to kill you. I'm going to have you executed. But here Pharaoh calls him in the middle of the night. Remember Moses said too, I will not come back to you. You will not see my face again. But why does he come back? Well, he comes back because God told him to. God told him, Moses, when Pharaoh calls, you answer. When Pharaoh calls you in the middle of the night, when he calls you early in the morning, you go. You go because he's going to let the people go. And so we see here this Passover, the 10th plague, the time that God skipped over the houses of Egypt or Israel and struck down the houses of Egypt. And again, remember, not only just the living, the humans, but also says all the livestock. All the cattle, some translations say cattle, and the idea there cattle is deceptive. Or the word cattle is deceptive, let me put it that way. Because the Hebrew word cattle just means herds, means livestock, means any kind of domesticated animal that is raised. So that includes cows, it includes sheep, it includes goats, it includes pigs, it includes camels. It can include all kinds of animals. Any kind of animal they raised, those animals died that night. The firstborn of those animals. This is a major, major blow to Egypt. That's bad enough, just lose the animals, but to lose the firstborn son, the place of honor, this plague brought Egypt to its knees. And so now Pharaoh says, go, get out, be gone. I don't want to see you anymore. Take your people and go worship your God. Then you notice verse 33. Verse 33, the Egyptians were urgent with the people to send them out of the land in haste, for they said, we shall all be dead. So the people took their dough before it was leavened, their kneading bowls being bound up in their cloaks on their shoulders. The people of Israel had also done as Moses told them, for they had asked the Egyptians for silver and gold jewelry and for clothing. And the Lord had given the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so they let them have what they asked. Thus they plundered the Egyptians. So the Egyptian people come to the Israelites after they have their God, and it's no secret, their God has brought this plague. Their God has killed these children, killed all these firstborn sons, and they say, get out, leave in haste. Don't wait around, don't hesitate, get out. They say, tell them all to get out, because if you don't, you're going to kill us all. We're all going to die. We all shall be dead. And then you notice verse 34. Part of God's prophecy is true. Remember, God tells Moses, you're going to leave in such a hurry that the bread is not going to be leavened. You're going to have a special kind of bread. You're going to have a feast connected to that, the Feast of the Unleavened Bread. Notice, before the bread could leaven, They had to bound it up in their cloaks and on their shoulders. They had to bound it up. They had to gather their things in a hurry to leave. And you notice the people of Israel had also done as Moses told them. This is past tense. They had asked the Egyptians for gold and silver and clothing. And the idea is they had told them that give us these things and we'll leave. This is what our God demands. This is what our God asks them. And the idea is that before this, the Egyptians hadn't fulfilled that. But now they give them all they've asked for. They give them silver, they give them gold, they give them clothes, give them all their possessions, or not all of them, some of their possessions to get them going. Whatever they could do to get out. And then you notice the Lord had given them favor in the sight of the Egyptians. The Lord had allowed them to be favorable. Although they brought these plagues, they brought these things, the people of Israel were not looked down upon. They weren't an enemy of Egypt necessarily. God was. And so they gave them what they asked. And you know, see in this verse, thus they plundered the Egyptians. Some have asked and said, well, is this not unethical that the Israelites robbed the Egyptians? No, they're getting their just reward. They're getting the labor they've done. Now, all these years of slave labor, labor they have done, they're getting their payment. They're getting what they've been owed. And so the Egyptians give them their clothes, they give them their jewelry, they give them whatever they ask for to get them out. And so we continue this story in verse 37. And the people of Israel journeyed from Ramesses to Succoth, about 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children. And a mixed multitude also went up with them, and very much livestock, both flocks and herds. And they baked unleavened cakes, of the dough that they had brought out of Egypt, for it was not leavened, because they were thrust out of Egypt and could not wait, nor had they prepared any provision for themselves. So notice what happens here. They begin to travel. Now they travel from the sea of Ramesses to Succoth. It's disputed and debated about what these two seas are. Most people think Ramesses is a supply city. It was a supply city in northern Egypt near Goshen. And they travel from Ramesses near Goshen to Succoth, somewhere, most people say, close to the Egyptian border, close to the Red Sea. And then we get this interesting statement of the first revelation of how big Israel is, that Israel has grown to be about 600,000 men. Now, later on in Deuteronomy or Numbers, we're going to see that the number is given as 603,000. This is around an estimate, a close. There's 600,000 men, besides women and children. This isn't counting the women, isn't counting the men, the women and children. This is just the men. This is why when I tell you to get an idea of how many people this were, this was easily 2 million people. And that's something that historians have looked back on and said, there's no way the Exodus could have had that many people. There's no way 2 million people could have left Egypt in one night. There's no way 2 million people could have wandered in the wilderness like they did. There's no way 2 million people could have crossed the Red Sea in a short period of time. There's no way 2 million people could have wandered in the wilderness. There's no way they could have had food and water and provisions and all the things they needed to survive. But they did. To the Bible believer, that's not hard to understand. It's not hard to believe. Because we'll look and we see the same God who did those 10 plagues is the same God when they got in that wilderness. What did he do? He gave them quail. He gave them manna. He gave them water. God provided for them. The amount of food they had to have to survive over 2 million people, I forgot how many hundreds of boxcar train loads it is a day. A day is a massive amount. But God provided it for them. This explains, too, why the Egyptians were afraid of the Israelites. Remember, when we very first started this, the Pharaoh wanted to kill the Hebrew children because he was afraid if they rise up with an enemy, they may overthrow them because they're so huge. They're so huge. And then another interesting thing is mentioned in verse 38. Not only is there the Israelites leaving, but there's a mixed multitude that also went up with them. What is this mixed multitude? These are Egyptians. Egyptians who have either been friends with the Israelites and they've heard about their God and believed him, or Egyptians who've seen the plagues and have converted to be Jews or believe the Jews. These are Egyptians or foreigners in the land of Egypt who have went with the Israelites. Now, we get this idea that sometimes we think the Jews were very, when we see the New Testament, we think they're very particular. They don't want to deal with the pagan. We're going to see that's not the case. God's going to tell us the idea just a minute ago about the Gentiles. Those who are not born Jews, how they can partake of the Passover. They had to do a very specific thing to take of it, but God didn't say they couldn't take of it, period. But what we see is that they allowed these people to come with them. And later on, we're going to see when they're in the wilderness grumbling, there's a mention of it being the rabble. Not the Jews, but the rabble, the outskirts, the outsiders, probably these Egyptians. And so this mixed multitude went out. And on that, they went with their livestock, both their flocks and their herds. They went out with all their possessions, all their herds. Again, you got to imagine 2 million people having courage. Yes, a lot of those, some of those 200 million or 2 million were slaves. They probably didn't have any livestock, didn't have any slaves. But there were some who did. There were some Israelites who had possessions. And you can imagine that if there's probably a decent amount of those 2 million people. And so there's probably a good bit of crowds, a big flock that goes out with them. And then verse 39, when they stopped, they cooked the bread. But again, the bread wasn't leavened. Therefore, they had to make the unleavened cakes. And I think this was on purpose. I think this was God's purpose. Because if God had told the Israelites, the plague is coming on the fourth night, on that fourth night, get ready, because the fifth day you're going to go, or the fourth day you're going to leave. They did not first day. On that fourth day, you're going to leave. Be prepared. You know good and well there have been some women who would have had their bread ready. They would have had their bread leavened and prepared. It would have been able to have this unleavened bread that would later serve as part of this feast to remember this very act. God caught them all by surprise. And again, they cooked this unleavened bread. This unleavened bread that they had because they could not wait. They could not stay around in Egypt. They had to leave. They were thrust out. That's the idea. They were pushed out. They were forced out of Egypt. There was no staying behind. Nor had they prepared any provisions. They didn't have time to prepare. Imagine the sequence of events I told you earlier that Moses tells them earlier and tells them Pharaoh earlier today, this 10th plague's coming. Comes to Israel, says, here's what you've got to do to be ready for this plague. You've got to find a lamb. You got to kill it. You got to take the blood, put it on the doorpost. You got to fix these certain things. You've got to eat breast and ready to go. You've got to be ready to go. When God says go, go, and we got to leave. They didn't have time to get ready. They didn't have time to wait around and carefully pack the things in their house. They had to grab it in a hurry. And that's the whole point is it was hurry, hurry, hurry. You cannot wait. And so here we get in verse 40 and we see that the end of this chapter begins to come to us. And we're going to see some more commentary before we continue the story. It says the time that the people of Israel lived in Egypt was 430 years. At the end of 430 years, on that very day, all the hosts of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. It was a night of watching by the Lord to bring them out of the land of Egypt. So this same night is a night of watching kept to the Lord by all the people of Israel throughout their generations. Israel had been in Egypt 400 years. Now remember, the promise of Abraham was that they would be down in Egypt, but only for 400 years. Some people say, oh, well, they're over 400. Well, you got to remember, sometimes in the Bible, and when God predicts things, he doesn't do it precisely. Especially in these early books, they're not precise things, just like the 600,000 men was about. We learn later that when there's a census and the exact number is given, there's 603,000 men. Does that mean that one number is wrong? No. One number is a round number, the other number is precise. And that's typical in historical writing. In Abraham's account in Genesis, that was a round number, 400 years. Here we have the precise number, 430 years. And at the end of that time, God took them out. In verse 41, all the host of the Lord, the word host is army. The company, the army of the Lord come out. These are going to be his army. It's going to march into Canaan. They're going to have to fight the people of Canaan and take that land. They're going to fight to get to Canaan. They just don't know they're an army yet. Then verse 42 is a very interesting verse because it says it was a night of watching by the Lord. It says on the night of the Passover, the Lord watched over Israel. The Lord watched over Israel to make sure their firstborn was not destroyed. He watched over Israel to make sure they were set free, to make sure they had received the plunder, to make sure they received their request, and to make sure they would get out of Egypt safely. And then, after that's all over, Moses says, now, this same night is a night of watching kept to the Lord. You see, Moses says that from now on, when you keep the Passover, it's not God watching over you. It's you looking to God. God looked over us, he says, that night. God looked over the Israelites that night as they traveled out and they were protected. And now, he says, the Israelites looked to God to look for that same protection, that same watching. That just as God kept his promise to them then, he'll keep his promise to us now. Then you notice, again, the more commentary, he says, and the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, this is a statute of the Passover. No foreigner shall eat of it. But every slave that is bought for money and may eat of it after you have circumcised him. No foreigner, a hired worker, may eat of it. It shall be taken in one house. You shall not take any of the flesh outside the house, and you shall not break any of its bones. He says, this is the laws. And again, we're going back and talking about that. But notice how particular this is. Number one, he says, no foreigner shall eat of it. No sojourn, no passer through. No non-Israelite is to take of this feast. And what I mean there, Bo, he means a foreigner. Is there a specific word here that's used as one who is passing through, one who's come in for business for a while and he's here during this feast? He says he's not to eat of it. He said, matter of fact, when you get there, if you have a slave that is bought for money, now this is slaves that were not born in their house. If a slave was born in their house, that slave must be circumcised. But he says, if you bought a slave and he's in your house and he wants to partake of this meal, you cannot let him unless you circumcised him. Now, notice this. Notice that this idea is that God is not excluding Israelites. He's not excluding the Jewish nation from anybody. Anybody who would come in and any male who would submit to circumcision may become a part of these Jewish people. This is not the Jewish picture we see in the New Testament. And that's because that's a man idea. By the time the New Testament rolls around, the Jews have become so divided and so against everyone else that they don't want anybody to be a part of their nation. In the very early parts, God's plan was for all people to become part of their nation, whether you were born a Jew or made a Jew. And then he talks about verse 45, another foreigner, or some translations say sojourner. This was a person who is traveling, who traveled place to place to work, or a hired worker, someone who is, again, not a Jew, not an Israelite. He's not to eat of it. And then he says, verse 46, when you eat it, it's to be eaten in one house. You're to bring it into the house when you've got your family, if it's more than one family, you eat it in one house together. And he says that when you eat it, you don't take any flesh outside. You don't take the meat. You don't take it anywhere with you. It stays in that house. And then God gives a very interesting note here where he says, you shall not break any of its bones. Now, this fact, this part of this is not really revealed the importance to it until much later. I think Zechariah will talk about it. And John will talk about it. And that this is one of the things that makes Jesus our sacrificial lamb. He makes us a Passover lamb. And when we read the gospel accounts and we read Zechariah's prophecy, was that the Messiah will be crucified. He'll be slaughtered. He'll be killed. But not a bone shall be broken. Not a bone will be broken. Why? Because he's a Passover lamb. He's the one that allowed God to pass over those covered in the blood. And he says, you don't break the bone of this lamb. You cook it whole, you eat it. And whatever's left, you're going to burn it in the morning. And then these are the last few verses. All the congregation of Israel shall keep it. If a stranger shall sojourn with you and will keep the Passover to the Lord, let all his males be circumcised. Then he may come near and keep it. He shall be as a native of the land, but no uncircumcised person shall eat of it. There shall be one law for the native and for the stranger who sojourns among you. All the people of Israel did just as the Lord commanded Moses and Aaron. And on that very day, the Lord brought the people of Israel out of the land of Egypt by their hosts. So notice again, he says all of Israel is going to keep this. And again, he stresses, if you've got a man who's temporarily in your land and he wants to take the Passover, he can. If he, and then notice, all his male household people will be circumcised. They'll become identified with him. Then he can come near and he can keep it. Then you notice he shall be as a native of the land, but no uncircumcised people shall eat it. Then you notice there shall be one law for the native and for the sojourner who is among you. What God says is that these people can become Jews. They may not be born Jews, but they can become a Jew. And one who becomes a Jew later in life is the same as a Jew who is born a Jew. There's no difference. Notice there shall be one law for the native and one law for the convert. They all have the same law. And you notice verse 50, all the people of Israel did just as the Lord commanded Moses and Aaron. They kept the Passover. They followed his word. They kept it when they got there. And he knows on that very day, the Lord brought the people of Israel out of the land of Egypt by their hosts, by their armies. Israel is leaving Egypt after these 12 chapters of God telling them, I'm going to get you out. We're going to get out. Just wait, just wait. Now he's brought them out. Next week, we're going to get to chapter 13. 13, we're going to start to see Israel in the wilderness. We're going to see the last big obstacle Israel's got to get out of Egypt, and that is the Red Sea. We're going to talk about that Red Sea and the significance of it and the importance of it. But for tonight, I want you to see this Passover, how particular God was. And one thing that rang in my head over and over again, I was reading this and studying for tonight, was the idea that God put in ways for other people to become a part of Israel. And that blows my mind compared to what we talk about in the New Testament, because we look at the New Testament Jews, we see them, they don't want to do anything with the Gentiles, they don't want to have anything with the Samaritans. If you're not born a Jew, you're looked down upon. Matter of fact, they call other people dogs. But here God said, anybody who wants to come to me, anybody who wants to take a part of this feast, they can, if they'll submit to the command. And to me, that shows me the foundation that the church will use, that God will use for the church. And that anybody can be a part of the church. They can be covered with the blood of God's Passover lamb if they'll submit to his command, if they'll submit to what God had told them to do. And same is true of us. As we see our Passover lamb, we need to remember what God did for us, how God passed over our sins and made us whole and made us one with God. Appreciate you joining us here tonight. I know we've been a little later than usual, but appreciate you hanging in there with us. Remember, Sunday morning, we will meet at 10 a.m. at the building. We'll also be live on Facebook and YouTube, and love for you to join us there. But for tonight, we're going to end right there. Continue to remember those we mentioned in our prayers. There are some that are on our devotional video on YouTube. We'll get that on Facebook a little later. I forgot to post that. Also, one little note for those who may know, I don't know how many of you know Wayne Jackson. He's a very famous Church of Christ writer. He's one of the ones that founded the Christian Courier and some other big things. He works with Apologetics Press. He passed away this morning. So remember his family in prayers, and also remember those others that we mentioned as well. But again, appreciate you being here. Appreciate you joining us tonight. Hope that you can join us Sunday morning. And until then, we hope you all have a God-blessed week.